Good morning. I hope that you're all safe and sound. This is supposed to be the lecture that corresponds to week 9, day 1 of Tales and Talemakers of the Non-Western World. I apologize for my breathy and wooden presentation. As you will suspect, this is not my genre usually, but I will do the best I can to get to you the information you need for us to continue reading the material of this course. In the next couple of days, Yang Bali will set me up with a way of communicating via Canvas, at least for discussions, and I will also try to get some sort of virtual office hours going, although I realize that you're now scattered all over the globe and you may not want to do this at all. One day at a time. I'm afraid that also the lecture style will be a little more wooden than usual. I've written out a lot more than I usually do, partly out of a sense of panic that I won't get through it. However, I believe, where's the book? There it is. I believe that you will be able to follow along, and if it gets too long and tedious, just stop it and come back to it at some other point. That is the advantage. You can't exactly stop me in the middle of class, no matter how much you might wish to. All right. The text, Japanese Poetic Diaries, translated by one of my teachers, Earl Minor, who was a professor of English and Japanese at Princeton University. And he, in this volume, which has been out of print for a long time, there are 3 important works. There's a good introduction. Then there's the Tosa Diary, which I'll mention presently. There is the Diary of Izumi Shiku, which is the text that you have on Canvas. And then the very famous The Narrow Road Through the Provinces, which is a text of an individual journey and often followed for pilgrimage journeys in the present day. A little bit like doing the Camino de Santiago in Spain, where you start in southwestern France, go over the Pyrenees, and I think it's about 500 kilometers along the northern coast of Spain to the city of Santiago. And don't worry, I washed my hands. And you can get badges and find comradeship along the way. It is a wonderful pilgrimage experience. All right, now to the Diary of Izumi Shiku. This is a unique form of writing, but one that I think will appeal to you even if it seems to be lacking in drama, partly because you have the interspersion of poetic and prose passages and the focus on a love story. We haven't had many love stories. We will have some as we go into short stories. But this is a form unique to Japan, and it is also one of the 3 great texts of its period, the late Heian period, and all 3 of the writers of these great texts were women. Let me explain. The Heian period, which is one of the very earliest periods of Japanese dynastic history, Heian means peace and tranquility. And the period lasted from 782 to 1167. You may remember that when we read the tales of the Heike, that this was about the events that ended the Heian period and the hegemony of the Fujiwara family, who over the centuries had become more and more entangled with the royal family, arrogated more and more power to themselves, until finally there were clans from the provinces who were just sick of it, and the Genji or Minamoto clan overthrew the Fujiwara, you've read that part, and ended the Heian period. Now, the books from this period are clustered around the tale of Genji, which we won't get to till the end of the semester. But the fictional world of the tale of Genji and the Diary of Izumi Shiku correspond to the late Heian period, which happens to run from 967 to 1167. And we have first, in the first century or so, the monopoly of power, the political power by the Fujiwara. Then we have the period of the cloistered emperors, when basically there's a dual system of ruling. The cloistered emperor, who technically has abdicated but still retains so much power, and the regular emperor, I don't know what we'll call him, who is constantly struggling with his predecessor, still alive but technically a Buddhist priest and cloistered, to have political power of his own. And then in the last 10 years or so, from 1156 to 1167, there emerged the military class as the main factor in the struggle for power, and they overthrew the Fujiwara and started what we call the Kamakura period, and this is the beginning of the world of the samurai and the shoguns. Now, the late Heian period represents a very high point in the development of Chinese prose literature, and it is interesting that in this period, the great figures of Japanese prose writing, although much poetry is included, are women. Murasaki Shikibu, who is the author of The Tale of Genji, Izumi Shikibu, who is both the author of and the protagonist of this diary, and Sei Shonagon, who wrote a book called The Pillow Book, which is a notoriously erotic text. The reason, or part of the reason for this, is that during this period, during the whole Heian period, men, especially men of the court, were very preoccupied with Chinese aesthetics, and writing poetry in Japanese that still leaned heavily and depended upon Chinese forms. By and large, the men wrote in classical Chinese, and the women wrote in a more vernacular Japanese. And one of the features of this was that the women used many, many fewer characters, or kanji, than the men. They used the Japanese syllabaries, especially hiragana, and the kanji are there, but they are relatively few by compared to the far more controlled forms that the men used. Now, there are definitely signs in the literature that women were well aware of the irony of this situation. And in fact, the first line of the Tosa diary, which was written in the 10th century, it says, "It is said that diaries are kept by men, but I shall see if a woman cannot also keep one." Now, the reason this is doubly ironic, I can't keep track of how many ironies we've got, is that the author of the Tosa diary is a man posing as a woman. Another, so with the different kinds of literary language used, and you can see this would be an extraordinarily diverse period with at least two literary languages competing or coexisting in the court at the time. It's no surprise that men and women should tend to write in different literary genres at this time. And the men tended to stick to poetry and formal genres, historiography, and so forth, geographies, while the women were free to write romances. And when we get to the tale of Genji, we will at least see some of the attraction of romances for women, both as readers and as writers. Okay. Let's turn to the Diary of Izumi Shikibu itself. We know that Izumi Shikibu entered into an affair with the Prince of the Blood, Atsumachi, in 1003. Atsumachi was the younger brother of her previous lover, whose name was Tametaka, and he died in 1002 at the age of 26. He was famous for being something of a Don Juan. Atsumachi represents a steadier and more diffident type, and Izumi Shikibu entered his household and remained there until the year 1007, when he died at the age of 27. After this, the facts about her life are vague, but she was a member of the brilliant entourage of the Empress Akiko, who lived from 988 to 1074, a formidable old age at the time. And at that court, or at that salon in the Empress's entourage, she actually came into contact with Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote the Tale of Genji. And while we don't know what Izumi thought of Murasaki, we do have something from Murasaki's diary that shows that Murasaki noticed Izumi. And apparently she wrote, "Now someone who did carry on a fascinating correspondence was Izumi Shikibu, but what a disgraceful person she is." Now, Murasaki, unfortunately, is allowing her disapproval of Izumi Shikibu's, by the standards of the time, rather promiscuous lifestyle to interfere with her literary judgment, which is quite unworthy of her. However, we can see that the author of this diary is perfectly frank about her previous attachment to Tametaka, her new love for Atsumachi, and she is very conscious of what misrepresentations of her past may do to her reputation and to their affair. Let us turn to the text itself and see how the autobiographical material has been used in the idealizing context of Heian rituals of courtly love. Now, Heian rituals of courtly love? What? You mean there's a handbook? It reminds me of the Woody Allen movie, Play It Again, Sam, when after a night of passionate love with his idealized sweetheart, the Woody Allen character says, "It was wonderful, it was fantastic, and I didn't have to look at the manual once," something like that. Actually, maybe I should explain about the rituals of courtly love. First, because there is, or was, a handbook. And the presence of this handbook, as it were, made this form of poetic diary a real creative leap and challenge for the author, because on the one hand, she had the aim of celebrating the ideals of the rituals of courtly love. Great. However, that's a poetic ideal. She also felt a responsibility to her audience to depict her reality. And that was the reality of two people, very refined, very intelligent, very lonely and needing of each other. This was her reality. And so the diary combines a reflection of events of her life with the influence of the poetic structuring of experience. And furthermore, it also reaches a very controversial ending for the story, namely a happy one. I don't know whether you will be surprised to hear that the rituals of courtly love usually ended with a sad ending. Now, ordinarily, you see, for a love affair to be recorded, you would simply have the poems that were exchanged. I owe my knowledge of this material largely to an article by Janet Walker, a great scholar of Heian, Japan, who was the first person to publish a detailed study of the rituals of Heian courtly love as it applied to this diary. Now, so Izumi Shikibu was certainly influenced by the standard depiction of a love affair as found in the courtly anthologies of Tanka and Waka poetry. They were commissioned by the emperor to preserve and spread courtly love ideals. And probably the most influential, the first one we know about, was compiled in 905 and called the Kokinshu. It is an anthology of love poems that depict a love affair in terms of moments of love experience. They are linked chronologically and dramatically and present an ideology of love which assumes it will spark, grow, flourish for a time, probably briefly, and then inevitably decline. The word ume, or dream, is probably the most profound image for love in courtly literature. It certainly dominates in this anthology. And since the dream state is regarded by both the Japanese and the Chinese as more intense than any waking state, love is inevitably linked with suffering and a sense of loss, because when you wake up, the dream is over. This is also largely a Buddhist trope where the discussions about understanding the nature of the illusion of human life often depend on the dream. as illustration of the notion that experience, however intensely felt, can be illusory. Now, while the European lover may attempt to rationalize his desire, the Japanese lover condemns it. It's a paradoxical truth about Heian courtly love, that although the courtiers submitted intellectually to Buddhist teachings and interpretations of the emptiness of love and earthly attachments, emotionally, of course, they resisted them. It's very hard when you're in the grip of a grand emotion to rationalize it as, one of the problems about doing this is I'm very aware of how often I touch my face. But I wash my hands and face before I come, I deem, my fair lady. In the court anthologies, the development of love, like the seasons, follows a natural pattern of growth and decline, with the difference that mankind's own nature provides the desire to cling to the perfect moment, which eventually causes the death of love. Now, what do I mean by that? It is human nature to seek perfect moments and to wish to cling to them. As a matter of fact, you can be in conflict about it because sometimes the very best moments will, of course, be completely unexpected. And if you're lucky, you will be the kind of person who is able to appreciate them. Or else you may think, gee, I missed that. And then you are filled with regret. And regret, people who follow Buddhism, at least in the text that we are going to be reading, they have a lot of regret. Okay, so what is this courtly handbook? What's the roadmap of a love affair in late Heian society? The Kokinshu shows an obvious intent on the part of anthologists toward definition and stylization of the stages of a love affair. Izumi Shikibu had to modify them slightly in order to suit the facts of her experience. Now, how does that go? By the way, the Kokinshu was not the work of a single poet. It was an anthology of appropriate poems from many, many authors that were brought together by editors to illustrate these ritual stages of the love affair, which, it may not surprise you, follow along the seasons of the year. One of the things that you will notice, especially in the tale of Genji, is how seasonal patterns underlie and often control events in the narrative. All right, there are 5 stages. First, love before first meeting. And in the case of the Diary of Izumi Shikibu, the page who used to bring messages from Tametaka to her has been taken into the service of Tametaka's younger brother, Atsumachi, and he comes to visit her. And he brings a beautiful branch of orange blossom, and this, seeing the page and the orange blossom, makes Izumi Shikibu remember her old love, and it arouses her interest. She sends a very encouraging poem to Atsumachi. Rather than recall the fragrance of the bygone orange blossoms, oh, you wood thrush, I should like to hear your singing to determine if your voice is also true. In terms of seasons, this corresponds with the turn of the year celebrated by the Lunar New Year. And this is the period when, on the one hand, it seems as if it is still winter, but the plums are blossoming. There is the sense of the world holding its cold breath before spring. And so he sends back, when the wood thrush can acquaint you with its singing on the accustomed bough, you will discover that its voice speaks with unvaried truth. Then, and this goes along very well until they first meet. This is page 97, when he asks to be received. Then there's stage 2, which is officially known as developing but untrusting love. This is a rather frenetic stage, fraught with little misunderstandings, unfortunate coincidences, and some willfulness. And this runs in the book from the middle of page 97 to page 107. A lot of time passes. It's a long stage, and they are feeling each other out. And many, many poems are exchanged. Then there is the third stage, which is called gradual development of love and trust. This runs, if you are looking at the text, from page 107 to page 125. There is quite pages 106 and 107 are mostly prose, and then they begin to have this more comfortable, steadier, this really more fulfilling stage. And it's at this stage that the prince, who is actually no match for her as a poet, and he knows it, but lucky for him, he comes up with the image that becomes their leitmotif. It's like they're playing our song. And that is the image of the sleeve of the pillowing arm. I'm sorry, I can't put this, put my hand right on this. But the idea is that, here it is, page 125. He actually touches her. This is the only time in the whole diary that we see him touching her. Soon thereafter, it was the 10th month. About the 10th of the month he came. Because he thought the inner part of the chamber so dark as to be forbidding, they lay stretched at ease together along the outside edge of the room. He spoke to her most tenderly and lovingly, and she found it a joy to be talking with him. It was a time of the year when the moon is completely clouded over and there is a steady drizzle. The night seemed made to purpose for everything that might lend a depth to one's feelings. He looked upon her lying there in the bone-chilling cold, wrapped in her thoughts. Many people spoke ill of her, but when she lay before him like this, his heart stirred with love. In such a state of aroused feeling, he watched her relaxed posture, half in thought and half asleep. Touching her gently, he whispered, "There is no drizzle, there is no dew that falls tonight, but as we lie here, a strange wetness glistens softly upon the sleeve of the pillowing arm." So he is lying with his arm under her head, and there are tears falling from her eyes and sparkling in the moonlight on his sleeve. And she promises him, "Your poem about the sleeve of the pillowing arm is one I will never forget. You may put me to the test on that." She spoke this with a sudden smile. And this really clinches his devotion to her. Now, stage 4, here is where Izumi has to start to depart from the usual roadmap. Instead of the loss of interest and suspicion stage, we have a section in which the prince proposes to install the lady as his concubine, and she agonizes over this choice. And this is the inspiration for many poetic exchanges, because basically, while he is a prince and he has a royal consort, he is allowed to take as many concubines as he wants. So he's offered to marry her and install her in her own rooms in the palace so that he can see her more frequently, more at his ease. Making it official will allow him, among other things, to use her as his personal secretary, and the idea of this is very exciting in terms of his literary aspirations. Okay, and so that's the 4th stage. Instead of loss of interest and suspicion, you're seeing somebody else, you don't love me anymore, you're getting bored. Do I look fat in this kimono? They're actually trying to work out whether to make this permanent. And then finally, this goes on for quite a long time. This goes on until page 148. And then, instead of the despair and solitude stage, which corresponds, of course, to winter in the seasons, the prince effects a stage of familiarity and completion. He installs the lady as a concubine, and once she's at the palace, there's no more poetry, no more poetic exchanges. The narrative actually turns to his consort, who is busy having a hissy fit over having this woman installed in the palace. And then but nevertheless, it is a successful courtship. The author saw the real-life affair in terms of stylized stages and moments of experience. Much of the progress follows the stock attitudes and situations of the kokinshu, the seasons, the images, but we feel that they are very personalized. Now, I am going to stop here because it seems to me that I've gone on long enough for the moment. I will record the second half of this lecture on the Diary of Izumi Shiku as soon as I can, and I will post it to my YouTube channel so that you can get hold of it when classes resume again. Take care, be well, be safe.